Haute Couture Week is swiftly approaching and will begin at the end of January. In my personal opinion, Haute Couture Week is the most magical time to be a fashion fan. It's a week filled with the fashion that I daydream about, fashion that is the pinnacle of luxury, extravagance, and artistic expression. Couture Week is a week for fashion houses to showcase their most impressive accomplishments in the name of fashion. This craft of couture is several steps above what we see in the quote unquote regular fashion week, meaning fall, winter, spring, summer, resort, etc., because these looks won't be mass produced. They won't come out in ready to wear lines to be bought online, in store, through distributors, but will instead be custom made for private clients that work with the houses. Obviously, buying a couture look is highly expensive, and the people who can afford it are few and far between. And then, even among the people who can afford it, the people that care to spend their money on it are fewer still. These days, it's mostly celebrities and figures from within the fashion world, meaning that for the most part, couture is not profitable for a business given the effort and time that these looks usually take. So, how did we get here, and why do fashion brands continue this tradition year after year if it is usually at a financial loss? Is there a benefit, or is it purely done in the name of tradition? As it turns out, it's a bit of both. So, let's take a deep dive into the history of couture and Couture Week and see how it has become the spectacle that we know today. So, to understand Couture Week, we need to talk about how the idea of couture even began. Haute couture literally means high dressmaking. This is both a descriptive title as well as a legal categorization, which I'll get more into later. The invention is usually attributed to an Englishman living in Paris in the mid late 1800s by the name of Charles Frederick Worth. He opened a fashion house in 1858. At this time, fashion had not transitioned into the culture of ready to wear that we live with today. The early signs of the Industrial Revolution's impact on fashion were only just beginning and really only for the men's market. Clothes for the wealthy were made by dressmakers and fitted to the individual, similar to the way couture looks are, but it wasn't the same thing because the dynamic was that dressmakers were relatively nameless. Maybe they could gain some local recognition for talent, but they weren't really thought of as designers and instead worked towards the vision of what clients wanted, which usually just followed the fashion of the time, maybe with a few personal flourishes. So Worth was the first, or I should say, one of the first well recorded and well recognized dressmakers to position himself as the authority on fashion rather than the client. He branded himself as a fashion designer, which was quite a new idea, and he introduced into his business many of the practices that now define haute couture, such as seasonal collections shown on live models. However, he did this in a salon showing to prospective clients. He also created labels carrying his own name to add to the clothes, and he created designs that were repeated and not invented from scratch for each client. Another thing he did was raise his prices drastically compared to other dressmakers. According to the New Yorker, it was estimated that a single dress of his would cost the same as a middle class woman's annual clothing budget. So, wearing one of his designs that were now recognizable now that they were all the same, rather than influenced by the client, was a status symbol. I don't want to over attribute the structure of the fashion world as we know it to this one man, because countless things have played into it, but you can see how reflective this is, at least of the world of luxury fashion today. He served high status clients like European royalty, aristocrats, and wealthy Americans as well, which gave him, and importantly, his new system of clothes making further legitimacy in the fashion world. Other dressmakers started to follow the same business model as Worth, which it seems was not initially detrimental to his own, but soon a problem began that would continue to plague the fashion world to this day, and that is design copycats. Some couturiers would copy each other's designs, and women would go to non couturier dressmakers to have similar designs made to the couturiers, which, again, up until this point was the generally accepted way that things were done. You would see a dress that you'd like, and you'd go and have it made for yourself. But now that designers wanted to claim their own work, this was ruffling some feathers. So Worth and other couturiers banded together in 1868, they founded the Chambre syndicale de la couture, and you'll have to forgive my French pronunciation. Their goal in the creation of this committee was not only to crack down on design copycats, but also to further legitimize the couture business, as well as to do administrative things like coordinate showing schedules. It's unclear how effective this really was in stopping design theft because it wasn't until 1945 that a legal categorization of haute couture was created and the name of the group was changed to the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture. This legal categorization came in part as a response to the rise of ready-to-wear clothing popularity after the Second World War. Ready-to-wear began to blend the lines between couturiers and other clothes makers because whereas it used to be that the couturiers were the authority on fashion and other tailors just made clothes to satisfy the whim of the customers, there were now other people positioning themselves as fashion designers and creating work that all looked the same, but instead they were doing it much more affordably using mass production rather than custom tailoring. So they created this legal categorization in part to distinguish themselves and further elevate themselves from ready to wear, probably in the hopes that couture would still be seen as a higher form of fashion and be sought after by the wealthy. Today, the Chambre syndicale still exists as a part of the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode, which remains a very important legal regulator and preserver of fashion in France. Today, a finite number of houses are legally designated as couture houses, and it's a protected designation that must be approved by the Federation. Strict rules actually cause the list of couture houses to change constantly depending on who can afford to keep up with them. Some of these specific rules are that the house must create 50 designs per collection and 2 collections per year. They must employ at least 20 technicians, and clothing must be made to order and include technical fittings, as well as that the collections must be shown during the official Paris Haute Couture weeks. And of course, the house must be officially approved by the Federation, which I believe also looks at harder to quantify things like technique, quality, etc. At its peak, there were over 100 officially designated couture houses in France. That was in the mid 1900s, but that drastically declined throughout the century, and in 2020 there were only 16 official couture houses. Some houses that used to be couture houses but no longer are include Lanvin and Christian Lacroix. At the time of recording this, there is not an official legal list given for the upcoming Couture Week, only a provisional calendar, but I think we can expect fewer than 20 officially recognized houses, as it usually hovers somewhere between 16 and 18. One thing to note is that this legal regulation only exists in France. Outside of France, brands have a little bit more leniency to use the term couture as a marketing tactic to indicate quality and artistry of their brands. Although sometimes consumer protection laws can come into play if that marketing is deemed as misleading. But even after the Federation was created and the legal definition emerged, couture houses still were not doing big public fashion shows. They ran only private showings to potential clients. There is no one reason or one show that marks the transition into what we know as Couture Week, but instead the spectacle of fashion shows evolved out of a variety of conditions, one of which was, again, ready-to-wear fashion. Stores began to be the place where shoppers could go to see a showcase of buyable clothes. So, although the private showings might be more intimate and more exclusive, it's possible that couture houses felt the need to further distinguish themselves from ready-to-wear brands by upping their game a little bit. In any event, their private showings started to be more structured and a bit more elevated. Additionally, non-couture houses started needing to synchronize showings with retail delivery schedules, which partially prompted the spring, summer, and fall-winter showing schedule for ready-to-wear. But the main reason for the eventual evolution into big public showings was, of course, press. Photography, videography, magazines, television, internet, all of these things compounded over time into a feedback loop. The public would respond better to a more glamorous and theatrical presentation, and then the houses, competing for attention and praise, would up their game. So over the years, you can see how this escalates and spirals to shape the extravagant couture week that we know. Today, the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode sets an official Paris Haute Couture Week twice a year, in January for the spring-summer collections and in July for the autumn-winter. They group official couture house shows with correspondence and guest couture houses, which are brands that may not meet the stringent requirements to be officially couture houses, but are invited to show by the Federation for that week. These shows are squeezed into a 4-day calendar that sits alongside the Paris ready-to-wear and menswear weeks. Over the years, couture has seen a steady decline in profitability. And as with many of the couture industry's woes, ready-to-wear plays a huge part in this. People just don't want to wait for their clothes anymore, especially for day-to-day clothing, which has become considerably more casual since the 1950s. It just doesn't make sense to go through multiple fittings before taking home your item. Couture looks have become only appropriate for extremely fancy events, meaning that even those interested in buying couture won't do so frequently. Additionally, one of the initial offerings of couture back in the days of Charles Frederick Worth was the status symbol of wearing one of his designs. But ready-to-wear has also managed to achieve that benefit using monograms, logos, and their iconic designs as well. So you can see that couture is becoming a harder and harder sell. One thing that I think is fascinating is that the public market for couture shrank at the same time that the actual cost of doing it increased because the public began to expect more lavish and elaborate showings. So brands are met with this pressure to create truly extraordinary collections that no one really wants to buy, making it a huge money suck. While branches like perfume, accessories, makeup, skincare, and licensed products become the true business drivers. So why do brands still do it if it's not profitable? The short answer is marketing, and there are two sides to that coin. Firstly, Couture Week is a place where brands can be over the top in their designs and their execution without really worrying about how the individual pieces sell. So it's an opportunity for them to reinforce their brand image and play up house codes to make it really clear what their label is about. Let's be honest, a lipstick from Chanel is probably not that different from a lipstick from Maison Margiela, but the identity of the houses is different. So playing that up during Couture Week might win you some customers in the profitable realm of your business who align with the identity of your brand. The second side of the marketing coin is celebrity. As I mentioned, celebrities are a huge part of the couture customer base now, and things like award ceremonies, red carpets, galas are really the only lasting opportunities to wear many of these couture looks. So they're a perfect chance for brands to collaborate with celebrities who might reach a newer, younger audience and help build some momentum for the brand. Couture is a way to reinforce a brand's prestige. So although the clothes may not sell, it's still in the brand's best interest to go all out. I think it is easy to look at Couture Week in a time like the present, when the masses are getting poorer and the minority are getting richer, and when certain unworthy names are trying to insert themselves as authorities in the world of fashion simply because they can afford to buy it. And it can feel like couture is just a vulgar display of excess. And I think that conversation does have a place. But to be honest, I think that conversation becomes a lot more interesting when we talk about it in the context of ready to wear collections, where the clothes are being marketed as day to day wear, when in reality, no one can afford to spend $7,000 on a jacket or $10,000 on a bag. Because the truth is, nobody is actually buying couture. So I choose to think of it as a sector in which high fashion can still aspire to be art. It is aspirational, theoretical, fantastical. It's a place in which tradition can continue in the fashion world as well as within these individual fashion houses. And it's a week where designers can explore the boundaries of what they want to create rather than being bound by catering to what sells, as so many collections seem to be nowadays. I personally love to watch these shows, but I'm curious as what you think, and if you think couture is still an exciting part of the fashion world, or if you think it's just gotten out of hand. Let me know in the comments, and if you like this content, please consider liking and subscribing so that I can continue to make it. And with that, I will see you in the next one.